Hi, Kathy here, and in this video we're going to be looking at self-portraits and how artists compose self-portraits. Self-portraits are a special category, I think. Portraiture, of course, involves creating the likeness of an individual, but when an artist is working with any other individual, you're always on the outside looking in at that person, right? Self-portraits are different because here you're on the inside looking out at the viewer. You, the artist, are painting the subject on which you are the world's expert, right? Only you know what it feels like to be inside your skin. And we're going to look at a bunch of self-portraits that I think may give you some ideas on how artists can use composition to enhance the feeling of likeness so that it becomes psychological as much as physical. Let's start by looking at Sir Stanley Spencer, a British artist. He painted this self-portrait when he was in his early 20s. Very remarkable self-portrait. It integrates the positive and negative shapes by means of value, right? It looks almost like a drawing in some ways. It's almost monochromatic, very warm tones in the flesh here. But the striking thing about it, of course, is the way that the dark background blends right into the hair and the shadows and the dark shirt and unifies the portrait with the negative shape. Here's a painting he did of himself when he was a bit older, in his 40s, it looks like. And here again, although you see that he's still enjoying working with dramatic light and shade, this time the details of the background and the details of the clothing are much more fully lit. They're important parts of the composition, but in a very, very different way than in the first. Here you see his hands becoming really important, and the paintbrush, of course, and you'll notice paintbrushes in the hands of several of the artists whose self-portraits we're going to look at here. Here's Sir Stanley Spencer. I would say he's in his late 60s here, I'm going to guess. I'm not doing the math, but a much older man, and a very, very different way of composing the rectangle. This is a classic problem, composing one interesting object on a rectangle. What are you going to do with that negative shape, that space around the head? And of course, what he's done here is very, very different from what he chose to do when he was in his early 20s, right? Here he's showing us much more of his environment. The light is very, very clear and clean everywhere. You can see every detail of even the slightly shadowed side of his face. He's very unsparing in showing us what age is doing to the skin on his neck or to the symmetry of his eyes, for example. And the dots on the wallpaper in the background give a similar feeling of intense observation and maybe a little bit of distortion. We feel here that the drama is not from the lighting at all, but from his psychological engagement with us. Still, all three of these, let's scroll back through them real quickly here. I'd like you to notice that although these are about as different compositions as they could be, there is in each of these a feeling of essentialness to every square inch. There's no place that you could crop or trim any of these three compositions and improve it, have it be stronger than it is now, right? And that might be a good standard for you to hold up to yourself as you work on a self-portrait. This is one of the world's great paintings to me, and to many, I think. It's a very, very simple self-portrait that Rembrandt did of himself. Again, as a very young man, he would have been in his early 20s here, and the exquisite simplicity of this is a little deceptive, really, because a lot of the beauty of this composition depends on the simple gradient in this background, just the very, very subtle way that it moves from almost the brightest white in the picture to this middle gray, and then brightens up a little bit as we come back down here, so that you can see even in this one head against a gray background, right? You can see light against dark, dark against light. You see the features of the face peering out of the shadows here, and then you'll see very crisp outlines against the light negative shape. The softness of the hair, the crispness of the chin, all these changing relationships of light and dark, soft and hard, combine to give us this very, very intense and yet subtle self-portrait. Here's Rembrandt in a more humorous mood. Some of you may have made faces at yourself in a mirror and tried to draw them very, very quickly. I know I've done that many times. It's a great way to sharpen up your drawing skills, and we see Rembrandt doing the same thing here. Even though he was drawing on an etching plate, of course, rather than simply in a sketchbook, you can feel how fast his hand is moving as you look at these scribbly lines. He uses line not only to outline shapes, but to fill in areas of tone. He uses it very, very fluently, and it's just lovely the way those two styles of using line are integrated in this portrait and many of his drawings. Here is Rembrandt at a more advanced age, in his 40s, I think. You see again the use of line in a very, very intensely developed cross-hatching, especially in the face here, to create areas of value. One very striking thing about it is the way that feeling of outdoor light outside the window is achieved simply by letting the white of the page glow through and keeping the cross-hatching and the lines of the landscape very, very dim and soft. Here's a self-portrait by the great Renaissance painter from Venice, Titian, and you'll notice the elegant simplicity of this, but everything is absolutely balanced and controlled. So the value of the negative shape, although it's very dark, still provides a foil for this dark skull cap, and of course a beautiful setting for this pale face and hair that glow forth from it. Little highlights on the shoulder of the robe here, little highlights on the chain that he's wearing around his neck, give just enough articulation to that area to help us see it as the volume of his body rather than a flat shape. And then down here, of course, this is like a little flame lighting up the bottom of the painting and drawing our eyes down there from the more intensely depicted face. Very, very beautiful. Here's Artemisia Gentileschi, a painter from the 1600s, one of the first female painters whose work we know, who worked under her own name and was quite famous during her lifetime, as much for the phenomenon of the fact that she was a female painter as for her brilliant work, although her work was brilliant. Here she depicts herself as the allegory of painting and incidentally shows off her skills at foreshortening. Another female painter, over 100 years later, Vigée Lebrun, also painted herself numerous times, often with paintbrushes in her hand. And if you look carefully here, you can see that the painting that she's working on is a portrait as well. Van Gogh is likely to be a familiar painter to you, and he painted many, many self-portraits. Some of them, well, none of them are what I'd call serene, but some of them may be a little bit more controlled, and some a little bit wilder. This one, I think, walks a fine edge, because although the color scheme and the value relationships of this are fairly narrow and controlled, we do get a little bit of warm, cool contrast between the beard and the sort of blue-grays of the background. But the palette is very, very limited here, obviously. And the gesture of the brush in the background is really the thing that unifies that negative shape. We feel, because of the intensity with which he has painted the background and filled it with these swirling marks, that it is a very important part of the portrait. It's telling us something. It's cluing us in on something. It's poetically evoking something that is an important part of the psychological likeness here. This self-portrait by Van Gogh is composed rather differently. Here we see him in the place where he presumably was painting, right in his studio. We can see an easel behind him and a Japanese print on the wall, the side of the door. We get the feeling that his cap was probably blue and his coat was probably green. In other words, he is really responding to the things that he sees in front of him, taking his own artful liberties. Obviously, I doubt that his face was really all those colors, but you get the feeling a little more in this one that he is almost recording as if in a diary or a journal the way that he feels, the way that his ear, of course, is wounded, and you see him with a bandage around his head, the things that are happening to him right at the moment. And this is another thing that self-portraits can do. They can record a moment in time and what it feels like to be the human who is living through that moment. Here's a portrait that I really love because of its extreme simplicity and forthrightness. This portrait is drawn on toned paper, which is a favorite medium of mine, and if you want to try this, I think you might find it really fun. He's working both with charcoal to create the darker tones, white crayon, probably Conte crayon, to create the lighter tones. And there are many, many places in the portrait, especially in the cheeks here, a little bit in the shirt that he's wearing, where you see the brownish tones of the paper participating in the values of the drawing. Beautiful job on showing us the highlights and shadows on the flesh here so that we really get a feeling for the volumes of the face, not just the features. I love this self-portrait by Thomas Hart Benton. Benton was an American painter whose work you might really enjoy. He's not particularly known for his self-portraits, but more for his sort of allegorical landscapes. But this is a cocky, youthful self-portrait full of bravado. He's sort of strutting, I think, a little bit in this one. And the forms of the woman in front of him, the clouds behind him, the people that are cavorting on the beach down there below him, all seem to be, they're very well knit in, they're very important in the composition, but they are basically foils for Benton's portrait of himself. Same guy, a few years later, much, much different mood, perhaps a little bit more honest and insightful and intense. The way that he is looking at us here, of course, he's looking at himself in a mirror, we presume, but the intensity of that look and the absolute honesty and care with which he depicts his much changed body and features are very, very admirable, I think. The polygons around him, the light ceiling, the dark walls that again sort of blend in with his clothing, the rectangles that are, in perspective of the canvas and the tabouret, the palette. Really simple, lovely way of giving us a feeling of the space where he is and the things that matter in this painting. This is not a self-portrait. This is a portrait by Alice Neel, a famous portraitist who she pretty much built her whole career on painting pictures of people. I will show you a self-portrait of hers in a moment, but I just, it was so difficult looking through Alice Neel paintings to pick even only three that give you a feeling of her scope and her ability to do a psychological depiction of a subject. The wonderful look on Phil Bard's face in this portrait here is remarkable. I like his hands too. I think they're very, very important in the painting. Look what she does with the negative shape behind the subject's head, how it moves from darker gray to lighter gray, and then again to darker gray and lighter gray, right? Those subtle changes really have the effect of making us feel that there is a space behind him. And there are places now where his hair almost melts into that dark value, places where it's very, very clearly delineated against a light value. Here again is a wonderful Alice Neel composition, not a self-portrait. This is called Marxist Girl, and the shadow on the floor, the door and the wall behind her, the forms of the chair, all very important in the composition. And here is Alice Neel's most famous, probably, self-portrait, painted when she was at a more advanced age and just felt an absolute freedom to paint her face and her body however she liked. And you'll see her there with the painting rag in her left hand and the paintbrush in her right hand, looking at herself very intensely in the mirror. Here's a self-portrait by Tom Phillips, British artist. At the age of 50, he painted this as a sort of birthday celebration for himself, I assume. I like the fact that he painted this on a printed page, and he used words from the text as part of the portrait. In other words, he saved the words out that he wanted us to read, and of course he painted over words without completely obscuring them, so we certainly get the feeling that the text is an important part of the painting. This could be done in a drawing too as well, and you might think if you're doing a self-portrait drawing or painting that you don't necessarily have to do it on white paper, right? So these, I think, are some approaches to self-portraits that I hope you'll find inspiring and may give you ideas of ways that you can really evoke some feeling of personality. I'd like to show you now some student samples of self-portraits. I have both paintings and drawings here. This is an acrylic painting, and it partakes a little bit of that feeling of the Sir Stanley Spencer youthful self-portrait where the dark forms melt into a dark negative shape behind them. Gives you a strong feeling, I think, of some psychological insight into this artist as he takes himself as a subject. Here is an artist whose self-portrait is in black and white against that deep landscape background, and yet these flowers here that have been introduced in the front not only give us a feeling of maybe the personality or the exuberance in some way of this subject, but also contrast with the reserve with which the self-portrait itself has been painted. And I think many of you, if you look into your own hearts, may see some of those contrasts as well. Maybe you can find a formal way of showing some of the contrasts, some of the inconsistencies perhaps, or extremes in different parts of your personality. Sometimes the place where you depict yourself or the way that you pose yourself in a self-portrait may have a huge impact on what the drawing communicates about you. And here I think the girl peeking out the window and then the light and shadows, of course, from the Venetian blinds falling across her face make a very dramatic statement about loneliness or feeling of isolation as she looks out at the rain, and very, very snappy composition that really brings the negative shapes to life as well. Here's a lovely portrait with some objects that seem to have emotional significance for the artist, and the negative shape being given over to the depiction of these objects not only gives us a little bit of feeling of her personality, but also gives us a sense of space. It makes us feel that she is standing in front of a deeper space that's inhabited by these objects. And here again, this artist has used atmospheric perspective to give us a feeling that the face, which is depicted in intense detail, if you look at the weaving in the fabric here and the way that the beard and the eyebrows and so forth are drawn, very, very intense detail, whereas the forms in the background are much softer and therefore seem like they are miles and miles away. And this self-portrait seems to be animated by a dream or a fantasy of these golden orbs sort of flying around the person. We're not quite sure if they're in her head or outside of her. Are we in her head or outside of her? It's an imaginative way of letting us into her thoughts, into her personality, just a little bit. And I hope that you will do that too. I hope you won't settle for a mere physical reproduction of the way you look, although obviously that is challenging enough. But I hope that you'll try to push past that to a way of depicting yourself that gives us some idea of what it feels like to be you just now. Have fun.